Top Med Talk.
Nick Harrison here. Welcome to Top Med Talk. This piece is taken from the Perioperative Medicine Shared Interest Group's 2018 annual conference, Measuring, Managing and Minimising Risk, which was held in association with the Australian and New Zealand Society of Geriatric Medicine and the Internal Medicine Society of Australia and New Zealand. Don't forget to check out the show notes on topmedtalk.com for more details. Have a listen.
Our next speaker is Professor Talley Corke. Charlie was Director of Intensive Care at Geelong Hospital for many years, but has now backed off from his administrative position and has recently stepped down as President of the College of Intensive Care Medicine. But beyond his clinical contribution to intensive care, I think some of the fantastic work that Charlie's done has been working in the area of difficult communication scenarios in intensive care and has really driven the training program in intensive care around that and improving the quality of communication and teamwork amongst intensive care doctors. But I think he's got a lot to teach us beyond just intensive care doctors, things that we could all learn. So, Charlie.
Well, I'd just like to start by thanking you very much for inviting me to such a fantastic meeting. And it's been great to meet so many of you that have been my registrars over the years, which is a bit scary. Perioperative shared decision-making, does it exist? I mean, it's a bit of a provocative statement, isn't it, really? But in fact, the problem is that patient-centered shared decision-making isn't easy. It's generally not done very well, and it's not very common. It's been coming out of the medical schools for a bit, and there's been a fair bit written about it, but actually transferring this from a nice idea into reality is fiendishly difficult. So the problem with putting this thing into the perioperative area is that often the decision is already made. As we talked about in our session about frailty, the train is often on the rails, it's running already, the patient's going towards an operation, and in order to have a conversation, you're potentially wrecking the train and derailing it, and that's an ugly thing with the momentum that's going on. The patient's stressed and they feel they've got a gun to their head. The situation's time limited, so the clinical reality and the surgical slot is, they've already got a surgical slot and it's going to be awkward if they don't use it. The idea that anaesthetist and physician not really authorised to interfere with the decision making, and the anaesthetist traditional service role. And I've certainly been to meetings where surgeons have said that when the anaesthetist won't do a case, they go and find another anaesthetist. And I think you might recognise that. And it also risks exposing poor communication. One of my surgical colleagues says it confuses patients if more than one person talks to them, so it should be left to the surgeon. And I'll leave that with you. So we've been doing iValidate to try to bring this concept of patient-centered shared decision-making and to train for it. We've been doing it for a few years, and it's been, for me, a fascinating journey. We've broken it down to 4 steps, starting off to just identify at-risk patients, because you don't want to do this to everybody, it takes too long. So just, picking the low-hanging fruit, who do you need to do it with, and initiating the discussion, actually telling patients what you're doing. Doctors struggle with that a bit. Then gathering information about their values, goals, fears, worries, and trade-offs, how they're thinking. And then shared decision-making, where you explain reality of what the options are and mix that up with the values and actually take some control. And then agreeing and communicating and documenting the decision. Because you don't do the last bit, then it can be all lost at 3 o'clock in the morning. So shared decision-making is a little bit complex for people. So the paternalistic one-way thing where the person gives all the information to the patient and tells them what to do. The inform, where you tell them what they can do and leave it entirely to them. But this middle ground where you're working together with the patient is something that's more nuanced and more difficult. It's like a dance. So we, looking at what the surgeons told us about the surgeons got to do it, we did a session where we're training, and we had urologists, and this urologist fellows, and they were very keen, they were very intelligent, they were very compassionate, and they knew that they were at a shared decision-making program, and they knew they were being observed. So I don't think we could get any better than that. And we gave them a case. So we tried to think up a case that would sort of challenge them a little bit. So here's somebody who's not looking so good, with prostatic cancer and bilateral ureteric obstruction. So no real argument about the clinical problem. We told the actors that they had unresponsive tumour, troublesome pain, not controlled, constant fatigue, frailty, failing. They'd had enough, they were sick of everything, being jabbed all the time, coming to clinic all the time, no energy, everything was bad, and they had a great fear for the future. You know, it's hard to think what we could add to that to make it a bit grimmer. All right? So, and the fact that, you know, it's bilateral nephrostomy at this stage, 32% displacement, 18% blockage, median survival 78 days, of which a third of it nearly was in hospital. So we haven't got a product here which is what you describe as fantastic. All right? So how are they going to deal with it? Well, what we hope to see, we hope that they'd ask questions to understand those things about the patient that we'd primed the actors with and understand things. And then a frank, clear, honest description of the expectations of nephrostomy. And then a clear explanation of the alternative, which is palliation and not doing anything. In surgical, and recommendation then based on the patient's perspective. And you can see from what we'd primed the patient with that suggesting that the patient could be palliated, the actors were all very enthusiastic for that if it was mentioned at all. What do you reckon we saw? You're not very kind. So, it's blocked, it needs unblocking. It's non-invasive, it's easy. Technical details of who'll do it, where it'll be done, how it'll be done, and when it'll be done. A routine list of the complications to get consent. You know, the surgeon's very prime for this. You know, I've got to run through the list, sign here. The palliative option, now that's been interesting, not just the surgeons, but everyone. So, in our course, what we've done is to try and get people at equipoise where they agree before we start that if a patient felt that they wanted to have something done, you'd do it. And if the patient felt that they'd like to be palliated, you'd do it, because they're both completely reasonable decisions given the awfulness. And we spend a bit of time getting them to that position. So given that we've worked hard to get them to that position, you'd like people then to present both options as if they're reasonable. So what do you reckon we see? Well, we see the interventional option. You could do this, it's all good, and all positive. Then you come to the next, look at the floor, wring the hands, we could just. It's incredibly negative. So we've videoed the two, and on one side, the interventional one is presented incredibly optimistically, and the palliative one is presented incredibly. Nobody could buy the second option. It is put so nice, awfully. So. And then the recommendation has no reference to the values. So we get them to collect the values, but putting the values together with a recommendation, we don't see. So it's interesting. So there's something for me hugely negative that stops us actually behaving in this way. So how on earth can we get there? The idea, of course, that the patients want everything. So that's how we are, and none of this stuff's relevant, no matter what, fight on. The surgical imperative, cure, care, heal, solve, that's what we do. We're the clever doers. The survival is our goal, and success is survival. Mortality is terrible for surgeons. Good surgeons can do, save Charlie T.O. High avoidable mortality suggests you've got a problem. Nobody must die from my operation. And not trying is really, really hard for all of us, particularly surgeons. That's what surgeons are going for it. So is that important? Is that what happens? Well, we did the What Matters Most survey with a big community survey, and we found that actually maintaining dignity, avoiding pain and suffering, and remaining independent are very important. So living forever isn't actually the number one thing. And when you ask what priority for your doctor, living as long as possible is not the main priority of many people. It's very important. It's different because there's a thing about this saving life at all costs, any costs, however it turns out, versus actually I have goals that aren't in there. So we've got a discord between the way we behave as in the medical world and patients' expectations. We did another study, we thought, to look at this, and here we were interested in how patients reacted to high risk badness. High risk of badness, a small chance of goodness. All right? So we've got a 5% good outcome. I think it's a 25% poor survival, and then deaths at the rest. So how do people respond to that, do you reckon? Because that's sort of representative of our worry, where we start to become worried with patients. Or we should be certainly worried at that stage. All right? So you've got 5 times the chance of a poor survival versus a good survival. So it depends whether you're looking for the positive or you're worried about the negative. And death, we're not sure whether it's positive or negative. For some people regarded as negative, and some people don't mind. So what do you think they do? Do you think this is what they do? I certainly want treatment, or I certainly don't want treatment. Is it a binary thing? Because we say, what does your mum want? As if it's binary. Do you think it's binary? Is that what we're going to find? Nobody thinks that? Okay. Well, what we found is this. It's all over the place. Right across the board. Certainly want, probably want, don't know, probably not want, certainly not want. And certainly when we look at that, you can see that the middle ground of not entirely knowing what you want is quite common. So when we say, what does mum want? Well, the most likely answer is she hasn't got a clue. All right? So this thing about what does your mum want us to do is really a difficult question. And we have to recognise that. I think we're deluded that it's a binary thing, and that if she'd only thought about it, she'd have told us, and then we'd know. Actually, we're in the middle ground. And the second thing is that that's twice as many people that probably not want it or certainly don't want it as want it. So if you're not sure what to do, you're twice as likely to be right if you don't do it. The human approach to high risk, I'd like to try. You know, if I've got the gun to my head and I've got a chance to throw those 2 dice and get 2 6s, and if I get 2 6s, then everything will be all right, I'm going to throw the dice. But if you tell me that if I get anything other than 2 6s, it's going to be horrible and you're going to torture me, then I'm not, I'm happy to just give up. So I throw the dice, I go, oh, bugger it. All right? That's how it is. So I'd like to try. I'm happy if it doesn't. I'm realistic that it won't work. If you tell me it's high risk, it probably is high risk. If it doesn't work out, I'm happy, and I want to avoid badness. But this is a bit of a challenge for surgeons, because this is about we'll do the operation. When it all turns to custard, we'll just get out quickly. And we have got some things to do to try to move, because that's actually what patients want, but it's terribly confronting to surgeons, the idea that you have one go. And if it doesn't work, we're going to give up. And I've had lots of discussions with my surgeons, and there are some surgeons who can cope with it quite well and are prepared to go to theatre and try, and accepting that they're not going to have a second go. And there are others who refuse unless you're prepared to sign up for the whole lot. And I think that's something we need to consider and think about for the future, because patients want one good go, very commonly. There's another thing with surgical buy-in, and there's a nice paper that I liked, the contractual relationship between surgeons and patients that influence decisions regarding life-supported therapy. So it's a surgical covenant. They use the word covenant. I love the word covenant because it's a sacred binding commitment to save the patient. Something very special between the surgeon and the patient. I think we need to recognise that when we're when we're being tough on surgeons. And unbinding the surgical. So I have a surgical colleague who told me about the unbinding of the surgical thing. He says, when the patients go out of his rooms and they say to him, I trust you, doctor, to make me all right. He says, I'm completely done. I can never stop. I feel terrible. I just have to go on forever. But when they say this, I appreciate you trying, but I know it's high risk. If it doesn't work, don't worry. He feels absolved. And so I tell all my friends who are high risk to tell their surgeon that. And I think this is how I see the world. So whatever it takes, no limits for the 7% who are into that. No heroics as a step down. Some limits, nothing really silly. Just so a poor journey outcome's unacceptable. Then nothing at all unpleasant. I just want it to, and then palliation. So our idea that this is a binary thing between whatever it takes or palliation, I think it's much more complicated than that. And I think if we start thinking a bit more like this, we can have a more nuanced, more intelligent, more patient-centered sort of process. So I think surgeons are not the only people who can talk to patients. Patient-centered shared decision-making needs to be taught and learned, and I'm not quite sure how we do it because it is hard as hell. We do a 2-day course and people are still struggling with it. The patient's wishes are neither binary nor certain. The patient's plans for failure are an important aspect of consent for high-risk patients, and we need to move away from taking a whatever-it-takes approach in every case, because that's not what people want when you listen to them. I'd just like to finish with saying I produced this book, Letting Go, in order to try to communicate this to people, because my final part is, I think we can all argue about this, but if we can get patients to be much clearer about what they want and don't want, life is so much easier. And this is the bit on the front from Annabel Crabb. We're not very good at talking about death in this country. This book should start 1,000 conversations. Now that I've read it, I want to give it to everyone I know. And I can't think of anyone better than Annabel Crabb to advocate it.
Top Med Talk.
Nick Majerison here. Thanks for listening to Top Med Talk. Now, before we let you go, it's important that we remind you to subscribe to Top Med Talk. That way you'll never, ever miss another episode. Also, if we could encourage you to join us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, pretty much every single social media platform, we're there. Join us. And finally, check out topmedtalk.com. If you go to our website, you can subscribe to email updates. That way we can always tell you where we're going to be, what we're going to be doing, and how you can join us. topmedtalk.com and click on the section marked email updates. Finally, Top Med Talk is proud to act as the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about them as well. ebpom.org is their website. That's ebpom.org. And if you go to ebpom.org/meetings, you can find out about some of the wonderful meetings that we attend and cover across the year here on Top Med Talk. That's ebpom.org/meetings.